Hello, I'm Gary Stearman. Time for another edition of Prophecy in the News. And today we have a very interesting guest, Doug Woodward. He's been here before, and he has a new book called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. Well, Doug Woodward, welcome to Prophecy in the News.
Thank you. As always, it is such a good thing to be here and to be with you.
I'm particularly excited about today's program because we're going to be talking about your new book, the full title, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. Mars, that would be.
Yes.
Who doesn't know about Mars? It's in the vernacular. It's in our culture. We talk about Martians.
Right.
You know, if you see a UFO or something like that, it's got to be Martians, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, the little green men, all of those sort of standard phrases we hear associated with UFOs and so forth. It's been a part of our culture for well over 100 years.
Indeed it has. And this book, by the way, takes you back through that period, explaining the really interesting connection between our society and the fiction surrounding Mars. It's a supernatural fiction. It is a fiction that has penetrated our astronomical community. You know, everybody's looking for life on Mars and so forth.
Right.
And the thing that we're going to talk about today, which I think is very important, is the intersection between Christianity and the ideas that have come out of all this thinking about who lives on Mars, or does anybody live on Mars?
Right. Well, the popular TV program, Ancient Aliens, that has become sort of a phenomenon the last 4 or 5 years. It's developed a very loyal audience of well over 3 million people that watch it. It's certainly a popular DVD that people purchase, and it's become quite a cultural phenomenon. And part of the point in writing this book was to provide some context to folks that are oriented biblically, to help them understand that what we're seeing today, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion, for instance, of L.A. Marzulli, who wrote the foreword to this book, is that the coming great deception, the strong delusion that God will send upon the earth, this is really tied into this notion of ancient aliens and where do we come from and what is the meaning of humankind and so forth. So it's really a salient point in what's going on right now.
Let's talk about lying wonders.
Yes.
Lying wonders is a biblical expression.
It is.
You've got some scripture that you want to share with us.
Yeah, it'd probably be appropriate to share. There are 2 scriptures that come to mind from the Gospels. Matthew 24:24, which I'll read here in a moment, Mark 13:22, and then, of course, Paul is in fact no doubt quoting Jesus in 2 Thessalonians 2:8. This notion of signs and lying wonders is actually used in the New Testament about 16 times. And it always relates to the appearance of the Christ or the appearance of the Antichrist. And the notion as well of, according to Strong's Concordance, is the concept of signs and lying wonders tends to relate to the heavens. And so it tends to suggest that whatever these signs and lying wonders are that provide this great deception relates to something from the heavens. And so in Matthew 24:24, Jesus said, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect." And then Jesus goes on to say in verse 25, "See, I have told you beforehand." Well, of course, what was he saying? He was basically saying, hey, I'm giving you a warning. You've been forewarned that this deception is going to be so strong, so captivating, that if it were possible, even God's elect would be deceived.
What kind of a lying wonder would it take to deceive even the elect, or almost so? And that's a serious question on my part. Something would have to be phenomenal, because we live in an age of scientific discovery. We're all kind of inured to the computers and the World Wide Web and getting things done overnight, 3D printers, the whole 9 yards. It would take a lot to fool the populace.
That's correct. It would. There's certainly no shortage of deception, and there's always been deception. So my sense is that whatever it is that becomes so compelling that the whole world is led astray, it has to involve, I believe it has to involve science, because we have become, since the Enlightenment, a civilization, a culture that places a high value on scientific research and discovery. And so my sense is that it's not so much UFOs or those strange appearances, the paranormal appearances. It's likely to be something of a discovery, an artifact, if you will, that may appear on the planet Mars. Certainly we have had that. That's been kind of the history of the last 45, 50 years.
We have rovers on Mars right now.
Right.
I think 3 of them.
Right.
Maybe all 3 are still working. I'm not sure. The latest one's called Curiosity.
Yes.
And it's taking these marvelous pictures. Beautiful, clear.
HD. High res. Very, very specific, very good detail. Yes, the Mars roving laboratory, the Curiosity, has it safely landed on the Martian surface August of 2012. And it's been beaming back thousands and thousands of pictures, close-up pictures of all kinds of rocks, of the horizon, the skyline. It's been quite an eye-opening experience. And of course, it's been the sort of the genesis or the catalyst for a lot more speculation. Even this last week, there was a picture being back from the Curiosity of a strange rock. They had been setting the Curiosity in place just to allow it to rest during a very bad windstorm on Mars. And they noticed afterwards that there was this big rock that appeared in the picture that the Curiosity was taking that wasn't there before. And so it led to the question of, well, who put that rock there? How did that rock get there? They called it, in fact, because it had a very dark center, the jelly donut. So it's an ongoing issue of speculating.
We're looking. In fact, and let's just take the conversation to the next level, because this is where we're going.
Yeah.
And in a moment, we're going to look at the history of the last 150 years or so, bringing us up to where we are today. But right now, there are people who have actually said that they have seen signs of ancient life on Mars. That is something like archaeological ruins.
Right.
I've looked at some of the pictures. I haven't seen any, but some people claim they are seeing signs of an ancient civilization on Mars. Now, what's behind this?
Right. Well, certainly, to some extent, I tend to agree with you, Gary. The photo evidence, to me, tends to be wishy-washy.
It's
not all that compelling, and yet there are a few photographs that are puzzling, let's say.
Yes.
But it really began with the Viking 1 as it was photographing the Martian surface to find a nice place to set down. It picked up this picture of this thing known as the face, the face on Mars.
Sure.
And NASA quickly dismissed it. In fact, they even began what has become sort of a conspiracy theory that NASA knows far more about Mars than it's willing to tell. And this face was poo-pooed as, oh, that's just a trick of light and shadow. We took another picture just moments later, and that picture demonstrated that it really wasn't a face at all. Well, it turns out that that was a intended lie to confuse the fact that it did look like a face. In fact, the picture that was discovered by a couple of the scientists several years later, that was taken a few weeks later, tended to show the same proportions, the same appearance of eyes and of a nose and so forth. So that's one of the real stories of the whole issue of Mars is there a conspiracy? Does NASA know more than they're willing to tell?
Now, this brings us to the whole story of the Martians. Going back to 1938, the famous Orson Welles radio drama,
War of the Worlds.
War of the Worlds,
yes.
Later made into a couple of motion pictures.
Yes.
Caught the people's imaginations. I understand from reading, some of the histories of that period that people really did believe that the Martians had landed.
Right.
And there was kind of general panic. And the question that I want to put to you is, what prepared them for that belief?
Right.
In other words, why would a population believe some guy on the radio reading a story with a few sound effects about the Martians having landed?
Right.
Why would the general population actually believe that?
Well, of course, the point I think you're driving towards is that they had really been prepared. Exactly. They had been prepared for probably 50 or more years by scientists and by writers that were they were examining the possibility. Back in 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli was the Italian that was doing sort of map making, and he began to talk about these lines that he saw on Mars,
Mm-hmm.
and that they reminded him of canale, not cannoli, but canale, canale, which of course we translate into English canals. And at that time, the Suez Canal had been built, and so people were very familiar with canals, and they knew it took intelligence to build canals.
Sure.
And so the concept of lines on the surface of Mars, it became a very common view. In fact, Percival Lowell, who was a successor to Schiaparelli, he documented and spoke very much as a kind of a cheerleader for the notion that intelligent life existed on the planet Mars.
Well, I can remember as a teenager being fascinated by Percival Lowell's seasonal changes that he claimed to have seen on Mars.
Right.
In the spring, things would start to green up, and these canals, as they were then called, would get darker. And then as Martian winter set in, the area would lighten up and the canals would sort of disappear. And so people were saying, well, there are seasonal changes on Mars. There must be people up there doing farming or something.
Well, it turns out that there's so much interest in Mars because in many ways it's so similar to the Earth. It has the polar ice caps. They shift in size north to south, which tends to probably provide some impact upon those canals in terms of moisture, moving perhaps partially through tributaries or whatever. So the issue of seasonal change, the fact that there seems to be darkening, there's been lots of speculation. Some people believe there is vegetation. Others say no, it's merely the dust storms of Mars that resettle the particulate. There's not really soil on Mars, because soil comes from living beings that die and decay. But there's particulate. There's these particles, granules that get moved around in these great windstorms on Mars. So there's a lot of discussion about that. But if you we probe more into the issue of ancient aliens, this issue of civilization, there's certainly a tie-in to two figures of the 19th century, one of whom we've talked about before, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, in her book, The Secret Doctrine, and in which she came up with the idea that we were, in fact, created, nurtured, or changed, genetically manipulated by beings from outer space. So this notion was existing at that time. She talked about Atlantis. She talked about an ancient civilization on Earth. And then another gentleman, Ignatius Donnelly, who was a Minnesota congressman, wrote a very sort of key book on Atlantis. And he argued that there was lots of reason for Atlantis, that the story that Plato told in his Timaeus, that it was a reasonable, it was not inflated, it was not mythical, but it was in fact true. And so this issue of ancient civilizations on the Earth, potentially on Mars, that really is the kind of grounding or the beginning of this whole notion of ancient aliens.
Now, we sort of have a three-way tie going on here. We have the ancient aliens tie, we have the occultic tie, and we now have the scientific tie-in, because modern science, and I'm talking about jet propulsion laboratories and the people who put the rockets together and so forth, strangely enough, have coordinated their activities with some of the teachings that fringe on, if they are not outright occultic tendencies.
Right. Well, that is part of the real story of Mars, is that it is a blending, a mixing up of the scientific with the paranormal.
Yes.
And of course, as we know, many scientists have always been very close to the edge in terms of crossing over from science fiction to science. And you certainly see that if you did a study of the history of science. You would see that there is a great deal of the paranormal in science.
And we've come this far, and now we have really come to the beginning of our journey.
Yes. Everything else before has been just a preface.
It has been the preface.
Yes.
And what we're talking about here is the fact that the lying wonder mentioned in the Bible is now a very great possibility, given the current development of events on planet Earth, and on planet Mars, with our rovers up there, the scientific community. People are prepared to believe the ancient aliens mythology, and perhaps if it exposed itself in the proper way, humanity would fall down and begin to worship those alien
those concepts.
concepts, the people, etc., the
Yeah.
individual that we call the Antichrist, who would be
Right.
propped up by this whole mythology.
Right.
In other words, we have reached that point now, and we've reached the point where I think Christians need to be conscious of, shall we say, the Martians in the proper context.
Right, right. Yeah, of course, we're not really promoting the idea that there are Martians.
No.
Right.
I realize that.
Yes, and we're really not promoting the idea that there really are extraterrestrials. We tend to believe, as does L.A. Marzulli, Tom Horn, and others, that this great deception that we're talking about really is a demonic activity.
Exactly.
Right. Now, when we come down, though, to the issue of artifacts, the possibility of discovering something on the moon or on Mars, that you look at that and you go, that has to be man-made, or it has to have been made by an intelligent being of some type. That really opens the door then to this whole issue of, okay, if it is, how did it get there, when did it get there, and what relationship, if any, do we have with those intelligent beings? And perhaps, as Zacharias Sitchin and others have speculated, did it have an influence upon the human genome? Were we affected by it? Were we somehow nurtured by E.T.?
Now, we need to be, I think, absolutely aware of this developing trend as Christians so that we can be on the cutting edge of those who would debunk individuals who are coming along and telling us that there are now ancient aliens prepared to open the doorway of communication with humanity. I personally believe that'll happen, but it's going to happen in the context of the rise of the Antichrist, which is what the Bible, and that, by the way, that is the thesis of this book.
Yes.
We have just a few minutes to sit and talk today, and you're going to be at the Orlando Prophecy Summit, March 28th.
I am pleased to say that I will be, yes.
And you're going to be delivering more on this topic.
Oh, definitely. I'll probably do at least 2 talks that will really drill into some of the more provocative aspects of the speculation that's been going on about Mars more recently.
And if you're there, you can actually talk with Doug and ask him some questions. That's Orlando, March 28th. Well, Doug, let's continue now. And I want to open your book to something that put it all together for me on page 50, by the way. He writes his thesis, and he says, and I quote, "Here's my thesis. Our minds are not simply receptors of neutral data transmitted our way by outside entities." And then he goes on to say, our minds really are more attuned to something that can't be seen, and there we arrive at a spiritual plateau. In other words, we come to a place where we have to realize that the mind is more than just a thinking machine.
Right.
We are spiritual creatures.
Right. Yeah, we're not just passive in this process. That's the point that if you study the paranormal at all, which for better or for worse, I've done quite a bit of that study and written about it extensively, but you understand that the human mind actually plays a part in sort of opening a door to these other dimensions. There's some element in which we assist in the manifestation of poltergeist or of demons or of gray aliens or of UFOs. And I talk about a number of those things. I talk about certain characters. Probably the most notorious is Jack Parsons, who was the founder, along with Theodore von Karman, a German rocket scientist, of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, known as JPL. In fact, JPL today pretty much manages the Mars missions and the Curiosity. In fact, I even have my brother, his son-in-law, is in fact even one of the project managers that was involved in the manufacture and the design of the current Curiosity robot that's trekking about the surface of Mars.
Amazing.
Yes.
Now, again, it always astounds me, and your book is just loaded with connections between the scientific community and the occultic community. That is, they used to be called the Theosophical Societies of the world.
Yes.
Now, I don't know what you'd call them, New Age movement.
Certainly, it's all related. The 2012 thing, Mars has always been part of this paranormal speculation. If we go back into the 19th century again, we look at some of these key figures. We look at Percival Lowell. Lowell, I used to drive through Lowell, Massachusetts, by the way. That's the family. when I would go to work from New Hampshire to Boston. But Percival Lowell, in 1894, he had gone to Japan to study Shinto mesmerism, to discover trance states in the Japanese culture. Another very famous, very important person was named Camille Flammarion. He was a Frenchman, and he wrote many, many books. Some of the most popular books in the 1890s, 1910, that time frame, were written by Flammarion. And Flammarion studied Mars. He had an observatory south of Paris that was actually donated, the whole mansion, donated to Flammarion. I think that's a pretty nice gift. And he studied Mars, but at the same time, he studied the paranormal. He would say in his books that he had virtually every channeler, every medium that would come to his house, and he would study what they would do. Likewise, even Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was a Jesuit, who was responsible for the observatory, the Roman observatory. Today, of course, the Jesuits are still responsible.
Absolutely.
As Tom Horn and Chris Putnam have talked about in Exo Vaticana.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's always been this sort of Jesuit connection with these observatories. But anyway, it turns out that Percival Lowell made a trip to Europe to meet with Flammarion and Schiaparelli. And I believe it was in 1895 that the three of them together in Milan actually studied and spent time with a medium named Palladino. And so there is this connection. Now, Flammarion would go ahead and talk about it to a great extent. Percival Lowell would kind of retire from it because he did not want to be seen as just a sort of a ESP, clairvoyant, someone that was into that kind of thing. But the reality is that the paranormal was a major part of the early interest in Mars.
Now, in your book, and I wish we had time to look at literally the hundreds of connections you've made.
Yes.
They are connections that range from comic books,
right,
early radio and television, what's his name? Was it Jim Corbett?
The Tom Corbett Space
Corbett.
Cadet, 1953
Yeah,
TV program that has this whole mythology.
So we have a whole generation that's been raised on a diet of sci-fi with the idea implicit and buried deeply in the human psyche that there is a group, they're out there,
right,
and they're beginning to make themselves known.
Absolutely. Well, there's even a connection with the CIA. What did the CIA know about this face on Mars? There was a comic book in 1958 called The Face on Mars. And when the explorers from the United States, of course, went to this face, they stumbled across it when they were exploring Mars. They went through the eyes of the face. They went down under, and they discovered a deep underground base. They discovered all this technology, and they learned about this race that had escaped from another planet under attack, and they came to Mars to hole up on Mars, and they created all this fantastic technology.
And now we've arrived at the place where we believe that we see in the sky from time to time little spaceships called UFOs.
That's right.
And people are now telling us that they're here and they're just about to make themselves known to humanity.
We've been prepared for almost 150 years. We see this, of course, in our popular culture. So many of our television shows, not just Ancient Aliens, which parades itself as a documentary, as a historical, factual content, but we see this in so many movies. Cowboys and Aliens brought the idea of Zacharias Sitchin to the screen. So it becomes just a key element of the preparation. That's why we talk about the fact that there's this sort of influence on the mind. And, of course, we might even talk for a moment about the fact that there is sort of this thinning of the veil, that we know from what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 2, that there is a restrainer. And this restrainer, we believe, is the church or the Holy Spirit, indwelling believers, is being compromised. And the opportunity for these forces, they're becoming more and more evident. They're manifesting more and more. And it seems to be part of this plan to transform our thinking.
Doug, we've got to do another program. We have just come to the interesting part. The book, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, makes the connections. I think Christians need to be aware of the lying wonders that have been laid out there today. I mean, for all to see. Television, newspapers, magazines, videos. There's a consistency to the lying wonders that are laid out there, so that when the man comes and says, I'm getting my power from on high, people will believe it.
Absolutely.
Wow. Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. This would be $21.95. We're going to include a bonus feature with it, and we're going to call this the Ancient Alien Package, by the way. When you call the 800 number on your screen, get the book and a DVD that was given by Doug Woodward. It's called Transforming Humanity into Gods. Also, we're going to include in this package Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. You actually delivered this before you wrote your book and before you completely developed all the ideas that are in the book.
Yes. Did a presentation last summer at Pikes Peak.
Absolutely. And by the way, it was packed with information. And we're calling this the Ancient Alien Package. It'd be about $60 value. Yours for $39.95 when you call the 800 number on your screen. And for a limited time, and I don't know how long we can do this, we're going to include a talk given by Mark Biltz entitled Signs in the Heavens, Blood Moons Are Coming to Israel. These 4 items comprise the Ancient Aliens Package, yours for $39.95. A great buy. When you call the 800 number on your screen, just ask for the package by that name, the Ancient Alien Package, and they'll know what you're asking for. Next time we get together and talk, let's start from where we are right now.
Right, okay. We'll do that.
Because we need to move outward and I think show people what is really happening today.
Yes.
And there's a lot on the horizon.
Oh, there's a lot of things that are happening now and a lot of speculation that people will find absolutely fascinating.
Douglas Woodward is his name. By the way, the footnotes alone are worth the price of the book. He documents like nobody I have ever seen. It's called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. Doug, let's get together again.
Thank you.
I'm Gary Stearman. Keep looking up, everybody. Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported program made possible by our many friends around the world. Be sure you tune in every day for breaking news and our daily prophetic news updates at prophecyinthenews.com or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/prophecyinthenews.